Should I share screen?
Yeah.
Okay. 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 Should we, I mean, if I can't share screen, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Are we getting, no, I'm sharing it. I don't know why. I don't know why it's not showing up.
Hit stop and then start,
Okay.
stop sharing.
Oh, stop here. Okay.
There. There's choices.
I should probably just, it's
Yeah.
not a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay, we won't share screen. That's fine. It's totally fine. We're gonna get it even without it. It's okay. We don't have to share screen. It's no big deal. I can explain everything. I don't even love slides to begin with. Okay. I really don't. I don't, but I thought it could be useful, but it's okay. It's okay not to. Okay, cancel this. We're going to cancel. Okay. This will keep on. Okay. I got on my. Let's see. Technology can make things easier and more complicated, right? Okay. Okay. All right. So let me start just to kind of give a little context. As I said, a few people have seen the play. I haven't. But the interesting thing is, a lot of times historically, really difficult traumatic events aren't really discussed or processed until decades after it. If you think about the Holocaust. There were a couple of documentaries in the late 40s, but the real scholarship and the books in the Holocaust memorial centers, they didn't come until the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. There had to be a period of kind of processing trauma. I mean, psychologists can speak about that in greater depth than I can, but it recurs in lots of different contexts. So therefore, we should not really be surprised that, Tom Stoppard, who's I think 80, maybe 84 years old. Oh, he died, right. But he wrote this at 80, right? He wrote this, I think he was 80, and that he, he didn't grapple with a lot of his own personal issues earlier, but they came out in other ways, which we'll see. But the context, it's not surprising that this was his last play, that this was something that it was sort of a culmination. I listened to several interviews with him, and you can hear that he kind of saw it on a very grand scale. So, but we're going to get to Stoppard later. Let's talk about the context. So the play begins in Vienna. So 19th century Vienna and 20th century pre-World War I Vienna was like New York City of today. It was the cultural, political, London, at least for that segment of Europe, Vienna was an extraordinary city. Theodor Herzl came out of Vienna. Freud out of Vienna. It was a real intellectual capital. And it was the imperial capital. It was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was an intellectual center. And it was a place where Jews rose in social status and cultural status faster than any other community. It's truly remarkable. Freud, Mahler, Arnold Schoenberg was sort of the founding modernist composer. Stefan Zweig, who was a major writer. Of course, Herzl, who I mentioned. And I mean, this is just a small taste. So Vienna was in many ways kind of like New York City in that really deeply infused with Judaism. And it happened very, very quickly. There's a really interesting Yes. Okay. So in the mid 19th century, the Jewish population of Vienna was 6,200 people. By the end of the 19th century, by the time this place opens, it was 175,300 people. So an astronomical increase. So, and the Jewish community was in many ways very assimilated and very successful. And it happened quickly. I mean, not everybody, obviously, it's not everybody, but there were really a really very strong, intellectual, liberal Jewish community. However, in Vienna, it was a divided city. It was in many ways like there was a group of Jews who had come out of the ghetto and had become immensely successful. And that was a small percentage of the population. But there was a very, very strong anti-Semitic section of the population. So there, just as the Jewish community is growing in stature and influence, anti-Semitism is essentially growing in influence. In fact, the phrase anti-Semitism, that's a relatively modern phrase. It wasn't invented until 1879 in Germany with the creation of called the Anti-Semitic League. And so this sort of the rise of Jewish life in Vienna and in Germany corresponded exactly with the rise in anti-Semitism. Okay, so, but this is another important thing to understand about Tom Stoppard and that whole community. Even though anti-Semitism was rising, Jews in Vienna and in Germany were among the most patriotic citizens of the empire. They were very, very pro-German, very pro-Viennese, very pro-Austria. It's really, there was a strong sense of pride because the acceptance by the kind of parts of the wider society led to a true desire for assimilation. I mean, sometimes we forget because we're living in the 21st century. You know, we've seen Fiddler on the Roof. We see some of the charm of the shtetl, of Yiddish. You know, we have a Yiddish book center. There's a charm in that kind of life, the stories, Isaac Bashevis Singer. But that's a very romanticized view of 19th century Jewish life. Most Jews wanted to get out of the shtetl, wanted to get out of the small town as quickly as they could. There was a desire for immigration or assimilation and acceptance. We kind of romanticize it now. And there were certainly segments that were very traditional, but there was a great desire to assimilate. People didn't want, now, when I say assimilate, that doesn't mean convert, although many Jews did convert. That does happen. Many Jews convert to Christianity. There was a 19th century poet, Heinrich Heine, who was born Jewish but converted, and he said baptism is the admissions price for acceptance. He believed that. Not everybody did, but so there was a difference between assimilation and conversion. Assimilation was something people desired. It was we can be Austrians of the Jewish persuasion or of the Jewish faith. And so that was a true desire. Okay. Yes. Okay. Keep going. So they see themselves as Viennese. Now, when the play opens, you see this large family that has been successful. And you see that tremendous desire for assimilation and culture. And so I'll find what I want. Okay, here. Any questions so far? I know I'm covering a lot of ground, but any questions? Yes, go ahead, Eugene.
You gotta use the microphone. We have
Lot of-
70 people.
Yeah.
70 people online. Yes, you have a loud voice, but not that loud.
The fact is that the Habsburg government was preaching an internationalism.
Yes,
Which the Jews
exactly.
loved.
Yes.
The Jews were of the many minorities in the Habsburg Empire, the Jews were said to be the only loyal minority. We weren't agitating for our own homeland in southern Poland. We definitely were trying to assimilate. We were eager.
That is I'm glad. Thank you, Eugene, for raising that, because what Eugene raises is a point I was trying to make, but he just made it very much more clear. So the Habsburg Empire, in which Vienna was led by an emperor named Franz Joseph. He was somewhat liberal and moderate for his time. There was the Habsburg Empire had a lot of different populations. So, and this was also a time of intense nationalism. This was the time when Germany, when Germany became really a nation, when Italy became a nation, nationalism was the currency of the 19th century. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, was against nationalism. It had an international because it was an empire. And Jews supported Franz Joseph in that vision because they associated internationalism, globalism, with acceptance and freedom and assimilation. So the Zionists were the opposite. The Zionists were people who said assimilation will never happen, the anti-Semites will never give in, and the only solution is our own country. That's it. In fact, Theodor Herzl, of course, from Vienna, he famously negotiated with anti-Semites. He would meet with people who hated Jews and he said, well, if you hate Jews, you should support the establishment of a Jewish homeland because then Jews won't live in your country. This is what, Herzl was very clear in his thinking. But most Viennese Jews of Tom Stoppard's class and group was the opposite point of view. It was, we are Austrians, we are Viennese, we are successful. Yes, there's still anti-Semitism, but it was kind of like, well, in many ways, it's similar to America. If you think about it, at least when I was growing up, and I think the anti-Semites were kind of the fringe, like the David Duke, like people from a small town that are sort of the outside of the mainstream, sort of the last vestiges of this sort of backward thinking. But and I think that's how Viennese Jews in the 19th century, they saw anti-Semitism in many ways the same way. It's an old backward, the world is changing, we're a global empire. Franz Joseph is moderate. And so there was a kind of misreading of history. And so that's, I think, part of the power of the play in that it opens with this incredible optimism and this incredible hope. We know what ultimately happens, but they certainly don't. I mean, that's part of the power of history. I mean, we have that hindsight, which makes it the tension all the more palpable because it was a misreading, a not seeing that anti-Semitism, which was still there. And in many ways, we could argue that's a similar phenomenon now. I mean, it's certainly, I don't think to the extent of an earlier era, but certainly that same phenomenon that we assume anti-Semitism is a fringe phenomenon, but it actually is very palpable and very potent. Okay, in fact, the mayor of Vienna at the time the play opens, was a man named Karl Lueger, who was sort of he was a populist. He was, in fact, if you go to Vienna today, he built a lot of sculptures, he built public places, he was a very popular mayor, but he was also a vicious anti-Semite. And so there was this tension, whereas Jews were sort of in a very strong place in society, and yet also there was anti-Semitism. Again, there's incredible parallels. It's not an exact parallel. It's not an exact parallel, but you could say, look at New York City. It is the most strongly pro-Jewish, pro-Israel city in the world. And yet it also has a mayor who is, truly BDS. So, it is truly, there are lots of contradictions. I don't think the situation is an exact parallel at all, but I think that it is an interesting historical phenomenon that this can recur, where there's a wider tensions between sort of the place of Jews in wider society and the sort of established political order. Okay, so again, also Hitler grows up in Austria at the same time. I mean, there's such tensions. And one of the important things to know about anti-Semitism, the kind of anti-Semitism that ultimately Stoppard reflects upon, is that it mutates. It's like a virus. So most of history, people hated Jews because of religion. Jews killed Jesus. Therefore, Jews rejected our Messiah and are satanic and will suffer. That was sort of religious. If you converted to Christianity, which many people did in the medieval period, you essentially escaped it. Not always, but In the 19th century, anti-Semitism mutates from a religious-based hatred to a race/ethnicity-based hatred. So it's not something that's about what one believes, it's about one's blood, one's ancestry. And so this is a tremendous shift in that it kind of essentializes anti-Semitism. So it makes assimilation irrelevant, right? If you assimilate, if you act, if you take off a yarmulke and you don't keep the dietary laws, oh, you may think that you are Austrian and are accepted, but you're really not. And so this theory kind of really starts growing right around the time of the 20th century. I mean, eugenics, I mean, this is all part of sort of 19th century, quote unquote, racial science. So this is the context in which Tom Stoppard and his family lived. And, you know, this is a quote. This is a quote from a professor at the University of Wisconsin named George Massey, who studied this period. And he wrote a book about this period, and he talked about how students would ask him, why didn't Jews in 19th century, 20th century Germany, Austria see this coming? So I think we kind of understand some of that now, but what he said is, it is very hard to see danger clearly when everything around you says you have finally arrived. We have to understand this mindset. There was a real sense of relief. I mean, we have the hindsight of history, but there was a true sense that there was a messianic feeling. In fact, if you read in Reform Judaism, if you go back and read the 1885 platform of Reform Judaism, it is incredibly optimistic. I mean, we read it now and we think, oh, what were they thinking? But there was a real feeling of optimism. Okay, so Tom Stoppard himself, he's born in 1937, and he's actually born in Czechoslovakia. And, you know, it's a fascinating story. He didn't know all of this until later, obviously. His family flees Czechoslovakia in 1939. He's 2 years old. First, they go to Singapore, and then they go to India, and his father dies. His mother remarries a British officer named Kenneth Stoppard. Not Jewish, okay? So they moved to England after the war, 1946. And as he says, he had a thoroughly British childhood. His stepfather was English to the core. And Tom Stoppard says that his stepfather used to say to him, "I've made you British." Oh, very interesting. I remember I did a semester at Oxford in 1999, and I would go to the Hillel, or what was it called? It was not the Hillel, it was a different name. And you would hear jokes about how, people, just like people who came to America, immigrants who came to America in the early 20th century were very, very patriotic. Many, many were. Similarly, Jews who came to Britain in the early 20th century, late 19th century, were also very, very patriotic. Would, or at least if they could, would try to speak like Englishmen. It was the United Synagogue, which is the Orthodox movement in Britain. They call their rabbis, they don't anymore, but at the time it was Reverend. It was R-E-V. So, the Hertz biblical commentary, it says R-E-V, Joseph Hertz. This was in the Orthodox. So again, there was a real desire for assimilation. A lot of that faded in America and in Britain after World War II, but that was there at the time. So Tom Stoppard grows up in a very, very assimilated, trying to be a proper Englishman. Obviously, from what I understand, he knew that he had a Jewish family that was lost. He knew that he had family members who were lost. But right now we are so curious. We study genealogy. A lot of people back, from what I understand historically, was said, past is the past. Whatever it was. I'm just moving forward, especially after a war. So we might wonder, why didn't Tom Stoppard at that time investigate his family earlier? But I don't really think it's a fair question. I think it simply was, we just got to move on. There was a war, millions of people died. We're focused on creating a new life here. By the way, that's how many Holocaust survivors in America were as well. And I mean, many talked about it later, but so it was sort of just like, keep going forward. And so obviously he has an incredible career and is an immensely successful playwright. But part of what's interesting in his own life is that his own career reflects in many ways what happened to one of the members of his family. So he had a cousin named Leo, and Leo was one who he's at the initial meal at the beginning. So, as some of you might know, the play goes out over 5 scenes. We're going to see, and so he's one of the survivors. And the reason he survived, he's sort of the shoe-in for Tom Stoppard, this character, and you see his story in that he calls it radical assimilation. It's sort of forced that when he became, after World War II, he was sort of forced to assimilate as a survival strategy. And he struggled. He knew he had Jewish background, but he struggled to say, how can I be Jewish and how can I be British? But there was no language for being Jewish. This is part of the interesting. Again, it's hard for us to relate, but in post-World War II Britain, there was not a strong foundation for Jewish life. Remember, the Orthodox community had been 90% of the Orthodox community of Eastern Europe had been killed during the Holocaust. There were very little remnants of there were small synagogues, there were different things, but for somebody who had a Jewish background, whose family was a survivor in Britain, there was very little. And so he struggles. He's struggling to belong. And let's see here. Okay. By the way, he's not the only one. Anyone ever heard of someone named Christopher Hitchens?
Yeah.
Who's heard? Yeah. And who was Christopher Hitchens? Who wants to answer? He was a great atheist. And do you know anything about his story?
He's a half Jew.
Exactly. Christopher Hitchens, like Tom Stoppard, grew up with this idea of being an extraordinary Englishman, British, I saw him speak once at Spurtis, Christopher Hitchens. He was fantastic. First of all, he was drinking throughout the whole thing. But he was so funny, so witty, so smart. I mean, he was truly a remarkable, and he had a very similar story to Tom Stoppard. He learns as an adult that his mother's family was Jewish, Tom Stoppard's mom didn't really conceal it from him, from what I understand. She just didn't talk about it. Whereas Hitchens' mom legitimately concealed it, that she didn't say anything to him about it. And Hitchens discovers it later in life. The interesting thing is Hitchens never really grapples with it. Hitchens sort of acknowledges it, whereas Stoppard really grapples with it. He really grapples with it. And I think that's sort of the really interesting thing about it. But the way he grapples with it is through this concept of memory and loss. So that's what I want to talk to next, is the difference when we think about history. What's so remarkable about this play is that it teaches us history in a different way. In Judaism, there's a difference between history and memory. History is a critical field. History is a science. Well, it's not exactly a science, but you have to go back, you look at the different text, you try to reconfigure what actually happened and what people were thinking at the time. And that's beautiful, and that's important. But memory is something different. Memory is what's important, what's the lesson, what can I draw from this to help me? Think about, and basically all of us live with memory more than history. Think about the Passover Seder. That's probably the best example of history versus memory. Passover Seder, we talk about our ancestors left Egypt, there were 10 plagues, so forth. The general prevailing consensus among scholarship is that there were not 10 plagues. There was no exodus from Egypt. It's a beautiful story. Maybe there are some elements of truth to some sort of exodus, but it's not fact. Yet, every year, all of us tell that story and we remember it. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. It's because that's part of our story. We have made memory is about story. It's about who we are, not actually what happened. And we all edit our memories. Think about it. I joke around about this with my wife all the time. You think about because people have different personalities. Some are pessimistic, some are optimistic. You think back to a family vacation. I'll remember, oh, it was so fun. We went in the pool. Everyone was joyful. And, my wife will think, well, the kids didn't sleep well and no one enjoyed their food. It's like we remember different things. That's sort of how life is. And I think that's kind of what Tom Stoppard is doing here. It's not really about history. He's grappling with memory and what's important to remember. And how do we, what do those memories mean? And I think that's sort of the tension here. And I think part of the reason why it's so interesting is the backdrop is just utter destruction. We often associate memory with positive things building up, but he's kind of looking at a sort of a bleaker past. And I think that's what makes it, I think, so powerful. And there is a sense of there's a sense of loss and a sense of pain, and it doesn't really, there's not a happy ending. I think that's kind of part of the power of this work and of the story, in that there's some happy endings, but it's also a sad ending. That family, that optimism, that hope was kind of lost. So, okay, questions so far. There are a few other things I want to talk about, but any questions? Yes.
Well, I think the psychiatrist or psychologist
Chairman,
this,
1 second.
thank you. I think if the psychologists or psychiatrists who are in this audience.
No, it's on, just real close.
The psychiatrists and psychologists in this office could answer this question, but do we not perhaps subconsciously suppress memories that are very unhappy and hang on to positive memories?
Absolutely. I don't think anyone could survive if we didn't. I think for sure. I think so, it's very interesting. I remember when I was in Israel, I spent the 2001, 2002 was the year I was studied in Israel for rabbinical school. And that was a year when there were really suicide bombings every week. It was a really, really hard year. And there were all kinds of studies about trauma that you would read about in the New York Times. And interestingly, I remember reading a study about Israelis that said some who never talked about it afterwards actually were much more psychologically resilient. Now, sometimes we think you should be, we want to let it out. And there's some truth to that. That's important. But for certain kinds of people and certain traumas, you just have to kind of just, not think about it. It's interesting. And I think psychologists grapple with this. And I think that there's a tension there. And in many ways, Tom Stoppard's life is kind of the same. He's sort of grappling with it now, but didn't grapple with it all that time before. So, okay. Yes, Jerry.
Not Jewish, said at one point that pride and memory had an argument, and pride won.
That's interesting. Pride and memory had an argument, and pride won. Well, I think that's fair. It seems a little harsh, though. If you think about it, do we ever know exactly why people do what they do? History is it's very hard to write history because we can't get into another person's head. So it's, in general, the only authentic way of looking at the past is through memory. What I'm kind of getting at is that history cannot ever be totally objective and totally factual. We're always putting some look, some direction. It's kind of like, if you're one of your kids or grandkids, let's say they want to go to some college, their dream college, and they don't get in. But they go to another college and they do phenomenal and they have a wonderful life. You look back and you say, oh, they were meant to go to that other college. Wow. I mean, we're kind of putting a spin on history. Yes, that's true, but you wouldn't have said that at the time. So it's kind of, history always involves some subjectivity. And again, so that's the interesting part about this play. What does Tom Stoppard choose to remember? What does he choose to focus on? Yeah. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Without giving away the play, several of the characters are either intermarried or have married people who have converted. And I sat there the whole play thinking about the impact of their lives or the history on their lives and what effect it had just overall.
Oh, okay. I'm so glad again you brought that up. Intermarriage is another theme in the show, not in a negative way, just in a descriptive way. The community of this is a certain segment of the Jewish community. This is a fairly affluent, successful, cultured segment, cultured in terms of read poetry, plays. And there was a tremendous amount of intermarriage. In fact, there's some estimates that it was about 40% in Berlin of that group before the Holocaust. And I guess this is not really giving anything away. There's an affair that happens early, and with a non-Jewish soldier, and the child of that affair is one of the survivors who inherits a business which is not confiscated from the Nazis. So in fact, you actually see in some ways how intermarriage changed history in some ways. Yeah.
My parents came to the United States in late 1937. I was their only child. When my mother heard about the Holocaust and the death of her sister and her parents, that ended her connection to formal Judaism. They came from a fairly modestly observant family. She never went to a synagogue again. She gave up kosher meat and any kind of dietary restrictions. I think it teed my father off, although I never heard any.
Smart man, yes.
And she could have used a good psychiatrist or a psychologist.
Well, I think you're probably right. I mean, yeah, there's people, we are much more conversant today with PTSD and people didn't know what, I mean, people knew there was shell shock and things like that, but you're right. And by the way, that reaction is not uncommon. My first congregation at Chicago Sinai, the president of the synagogue was a wonderful guy, Alec Harris. His father was a Holocaust survivor, and even his son was president of the synagogue. If dad never came to the synagogue, not once. So he had that. He wasn't anti-Jewish. It was sort of like organized religion, And so I think that not uncommon. And then there's almost the opposite reaction. There are, the ultra Orthodox who said, because of this, we have to have, 9 or 10 kids, So there's and become more observant. So there's different reactions. That's just how we human beings are wired. Yeah. Who else had their hand up? Yeah.
I keep going.
Okay. The intermarriage piece is very, very important because one of the things that Stoppard is getting at, and there were certain stereotypes about Jews, Jews don't drink alcohol, Jews don't have affairs, Jews don't do certain things. And in some ways, again, early 20th century Viennese, what Stoppard is kind of suggesting is that Jews were kind of breaking some of these taboos as society, the Jewish community itself was changing. There were, in fact, the early 20th century, prior to World War I, was the period in which there was the most conversion from Judaism to Christianity. There were many Jews that period of time. And nobody, it's not a huge percentage. Some people say it goes 10%. It was not a large percentage, but there were many. And part of it was this, that's the old world. That's the backward world. Again, World War I destroyed all of that. In fact, that's kind of what I wanted to get to next. There's a British historian, Jewish historian named Simon Schama. Anyone ever heard of him? Remarkable. He's one of those guys who can kind of talk about anything, Rembrandt, art. I mean, it's remarkable. And he talks about that this was Leopold, like the name itself, Leopoldstadt, that was the name for a certain neighborhood. And it was like a world in itself. It was a unique, extraordinary world of Jewish creativity, of intellectual ferment. I mean, this was a kind of precious sort of jewel that was lost. And that what we can do, what Stoppard is trying to do, is kind of pull out what is the memory? What can we take from it? And yeah, this is what he says. He did a great analysis of the play, where he said one of the questions it leaves us is, what do we owe, or what is our responsibility to the people whose own stories made our lives possible? So essentially, the choices that Tom Stoppard's parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, that they made absolutely dramatically transformed his own life, obviously. So what's his responsibility to them? What do you think? Think about our own. I think about this sometimes. Think about grandparents, great-grandparents who immigrated from wherever, Poland, Romania, Germany, wherever. We think about it now, and we think about, God, they were so smart. They were, they were the ones, they knew what they were doing. They didn't know. Nobody, if people knew that the Holocaust was coming, everybody would have left. So it took a real kind of courage. Maybe even, there was one historian named Arthur Hertzberg who was he said, American Jews, we are the descendants of the people who were like the rabble rousers. Like it was the people who were sort of the dark sheep of the family who left Europe and came to America, and we're their descendants. Now, I think he probably overstated the case a little bit more, but what he was trying to get at is it took a certain kind of courage, a certain kind of not irrationality, but risk to immigrate. So what do we owe those people? What do you think?
Bernie.
Yeah, Bernie.
I know it's not today's topic, but hanging alongside everything you've been talking about
Yeah.
was the Yiddish culture that was destroyed.
Destroyed. Exactly. Yes.
This was, all of our parents, the two singers, Shalom Aleichem, the labor movement.
Yeah.
It was an incredible culture.
Yeah.
Destroyed.
You're so right. And I think that is sort of the psychological in some ways, he's grappling with the fact that the 20th century was a time of massive loss for the Jewish people. I mean, truly, you're right. This entire Yiddish culture. At the same time, there's a paradox in that it's also a time of tremendous gain. Tremendous. Look at the state of Israel, the American Jewish community is incredibly. Look at Tom Stoppard's career. I mean, he's one of the most celebrated playwrights, and I mean, he's celebrated around the world. So he's grappling with this extraordinary loss, but also this extraordinary gain. I mean, it's a tragedy and a wonderful drama. That's what makes it so powerful. And in some ways, you can't grapple with it until decades after it. I think that's part of what it is. Yes.
Of a tree, and a tree and history, and so much of us are not interested in history. I was never interested in history growing up. As the only child of an only survivor, I really struggle for that history now. I need those roots. I don't know how to get those roots. And then I think, well, maybe the roots aren't so strong, But some of the branches might be a little bit different, or have a different loop than we might thought. But there's still that constant struggle of where was that root and what was the initial part behind it, and whether or not that tree is strong depends on how those roots were and all the fragility of the wind and everything else around it.
So true. I think part of what the example, or one of the quote unquote lessons of the play, is kind of the role of luck and randomness. His mom met Kenneth Stoppard, and Kenneth Stoppard was a great dad and a great Englishman, and he survived the war. I mean, so much of it is this life, this celebrated life, was made possible by decisions made by people he didn't even know, and then just by random luck. And that's, I mean, that's true for a lot of people, but I think that's partly what he's also trying to get at in the play. Yeah.
Did you watch the series Vienna Blood on Channel 11?
No, I haven't. What it?
It was based, some of my literary friends here, based on the Lieberman novels that take place pre-World War I in Vienna. And it concerns the relation, the procedural crime, that's why we watch it. And it concerns the relationship between Max Lieberman, who belongs to this bourgeois Jewish family that owns a factory. They immigrated from England, and they observe Shabbat, they meet on Friday night. And their son Max is a disciple of Sigmund Freud, and he befriends this Czech police officer. And by the end of the 4 years, they become very close in family. They solve crimes, but this is a fiction of this time, like around 1909. Of this
Fascinating. I'll have to look at that. This is I have a good friend of mine named Mark Rothschild. He's also a rabbi. He was like one of my best friends in rabbinical school. He never really functioned as a rabbi. He started a business and has become very, very successful. In fact, yes, he bought a house from one of the children of one of our members. Mark's family was from Vienna and Germany, and his grandparents were very successful and lost all, this is went through a whole, this group experienced so much, and often some of them came to America and were able to recreate that same thing. Yes, Eugene.
Well, first off, for Vienna Blood, if you'd like to ever hear an Irishman try to sound gay, I really recommend that series. What is Shakespeare? No, I watch it, but obviously not a fan. Couple things I want to-
Thanks for letting us know.
First off, talking about the level of culture. The
Tremendous.
The Jews of Vienna.
Tremendous.
And their wealth. I mean, let's count all the blondes that Klimt painted.
Yeah, most are for.
Blonde Willett.
Yeah.
No, he was.
Not many. Yeah. Yeah.
He was, the Jewish gift, and he himself was Gentile, but he was,
Right.
he was beloved by the
Right.
Jewish
Yes,
community.
yes.
And if you would like a contemporary Jewish writer of that period, I would recommend the playwright Schindler. Schnitzler.
Yes, Schnitzer. Yes. He's very highly regarded. Yes.
I mean, he technically, if Eyes Wide Shut had been done in accordance with the original characters, you would have had Fran Drescher and Jason Alexander.
Hello, we lost you.
Okay, it was a city of extremes. Okay, I heard something. It was. Let me make sure I hit the right button. It was a city of extremes. So you had extremes in wealth, extremes in culture, extremes in anti-Semitism. So there's a great joke, a famous joke about two Jewish friends who are sitting at a coffee house, and one of them is reading a notorious anti-Semitic newspaper. And the Jewish guy and his friend says, "Why are you reading that? It's terrible." And the guy said, "Well, my life is not that great, but when I hear about all the rich Jews who control the movies, who control the theater, who control the politicians, it makes me feel kind of good, you know? So except, but is that it's a time of extremes. There was extreme Jewish prominence and also extreme anti-Semitism. And in some ways, that's kind of somehow where we are now. In many ways, we're living in this period of extremes. And so I think that kind of it raises the stakes. It helps give us some insight into this world. And the sad thing is, it's in many ways kind of a warning. What destroyed that world was World War I and then ultimately the Holocaust. But some of the assimilation and acceptance we take for granted isn't always as solid as we think. I think that's part of the lesson. Yeah. What else? Yeah, Judy, go ahead.
Yes, I just, to your point about what do we think about Tom Stoppard living with this, I have to sense more, if I wonder if it's more guilt, right? So he was the one to survive it and he was able to escape having to bear this burden of Jewishness because he went to England. So I wonder if that's part of his thinking through writing the play.
Oh, I'm certain. Yes. I mean, survivor's guilt is very, very strong. And I think some people feel it more strongly than others, but I do think it's definitely in the background of a lot of things. It's this really how we deal with trauma. The play is both historical but also psychological, and I think that's part of the Jewish narrative of the 20th century. But another important thing about this play, I've kind of talked about how relevant it is given the context of the time now. But in many ways, it's also kind of the end of a certain world. That world of the refugees, of the immigrant generation, we think about Ellis Island and that world is slowly, not even slowly, it's American Judaism is the American Jewish community today is very different than it was when I started my rabbinate. And these changes are truly redefining. And so I think that in some ways this is a very relevant, but it's also a kind of elegy for a certain part of the Jewish experience that I think is very powerful. Yeah. Other final questions or comments? Yes, go ahead, Bob. Vanessa wants everyone on Zoom to hear.
I'm sure you can hear me now, but I've had 5 comments.
I'm not gonna see the play until end of July, but from what I'm gathering, the assimilation was part of the factors that led to the deaths of many Jews. Because when I come from a large family, they all came from Poland and small towns. They left because of pogroms, poverty, lack of opportunity, anti-Semitism. It wasn't that they were courageous, although it does take a certain amount of courage to go to a foreign place. But the ones that consider themselves assimilated, integrated, successful, well, nothing would ever happen to us, right? We're doctors, we're judges, we're this, we're that. So we're okay, and becoming patriotic is part of that. The patriotic, some things that happen to us, we're patriotic, or we're, country. So part of my thought in the play is that assimilation ended up leading to some bad consequences. The people that weren't assimilated were much more likely to emigrate. And most of us here live in Leopoldstadt, right?
Yeah.
Island Park? Yeah.
You go to central Illinois, southern Illinois, and ask them what they think about Jews, they're not necessarily anti-Semitic at all, but are they likely, given the right influences in leadership, to have this, what many of us do as human beings, them versus us, are they gonna become, us?
Oh, people are very malleable. Yes, yeah.
Right. And so, I'm concerned, I don't know what to do about it, because I don't think it's extreme, the fringes of anti-Semitism.
Not anymore, no.
And we're in this bubble, which feels really good, I enjoy it, I've been here 4 years, I'm loving it. But I also know where I came from on the south side, and it was a very different, gestalt there.
Such a good question, but I want to go back to the critique that you have is a fair one, that in some ways, some of the more assimilated, successful Viennese and German Jews may have deluded or deceived themselves to think that they were, but I don't think we can blame them. I mean, it's very hard to put ourselves in their shoes. You know, if you had come from nothing and built a business and you were finally accepted, I mean, you want to cling to it. It's something, and I think it's still very hard for people to imagine how the Holocaust would have unfolded. Even in 1938, after Christmas, I mean, I think basically almost every most successful German Jews in 1938 after Kristallnacht kind of realized, okay, this is not, not everybody, again, not everybody, but many. But at that point, it was already too hard. But we have to try to, I mean, good historians, we have to have empathy for people that may have made decisions that were harmful, but we don't know what was going on in their heads. And there were some families where there was intermarriage and certain people were kind of protected. So it is very hard. But when you talk about the bubble in anti-Semitism, I think you're right. I do think that that's where there is some very important relevance in that, in some ways, we can easily fool ourselves. If we live in a bubble, we can assume people think the way we do, not just about Judaism. We can think people think similarly on LGBTQ issues or on, anything, abortion, whatever. And so there are so many things where if we live in a bubble, which in many ways, the more society becomes interconnected with technology, the more we live in those bubbles. It's like the opposite, everything's curated. So I think it's a danger. Of course it's a danger. Yeah.
Wait, before we go on, if we are gonna end in a couple of minutes, Wendy Rose commented that she saw the play yesterday.
Oh, good.
And she also saw it on Broadway. The writer's theater version is much more powerful because of the intimate setting. It was amazing. She also said we didn't see it as much as an elegy, as a commentary on what's happening today.
Yeah.
It was scary, many parallels.
Good there. Good. See, this is a sign of a great work of art, obviously, and of a brilliant mind that we can look at it in all kinds of different ways. It's obviously a brilliant play. Who else had? Yeah.
Wait, sure. Sandy.
One quick thought about why Jews of Germany or Eastern Europe had no concept of the Holocaust. Well, we have to remember that after Kristallnacht, it was 3 years.
Right.
So the actual Holocaust was planned and plotted at the Wannsee Conference, and it really didn't begin in huge numbers.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
And they had 3 years to think about it, but nobody thought it would come to that.
Yeah.
Just as we can't imagine such a thing happening here, but it could.
When I was in 1999, between my junior and senior year of college, I went on a trip to Germany it was a really cool program. And we went to that house where the document, the quote unquote final solution document, it's a beautiful house. And the unimaginable horror in contrast with this beautiful setting in suburban Berlin, it's mind-boggling. I mean, it
documents that.
Yeah, that was, yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful house. It's incredible. Yeah.
I grew up on the west side of Chicago, what we call St. Mel's Parish. It was just outside of the Jewish neighborhoods, 2 blocks west, totally different than if you went 2 blocks east. Terrible anti-Semitism, called dirty Jew all the time. Okay, I grew up with that, but I grew up getting over that
and feeling like most of you that life was good, and I didn't have to fear that. Feeling good as a Jew. I didn't grow up in Highland Park. I didn't ever have this kind of Jewish setting. David and I lived on the south side, the far south side for 16 years.
Yeah.
I felt a little
Different.
bit there.
Different.
But then, once we returned from living in Israel for 12 years, and we came to Northbrook, and it's like Highland Park, I felt like I'm in a safe Jewish neighborhood, and everything is fine. I never thought about anti-Semitism until recently. And there are two things that keep me awake at night. I see when people write into the papers what they say on the radio and on television. The two things are, every time they talk about Epstein, it's like a reflection on Jewish men. Then the other thing is October 7th, which we feel the pain of. But suddenly, especially among lower class people in the United States, they are turning us into the enemy. They're blaming the Jews and the Israelis for what happened to the poor Palestinians. And
Yeah, but that's been happening a long time. I mean, I don't think it's anything new, but that's good. No, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
Aware. We have to be aware.
Right.
We have to be strong and teach our kids and our grandchildren.
Right.
To be strong and don't let anyone.
I think that's important.
That's why you're all members at Macomb Select. And you put your kids and grandkids in lab learning. Rabbi, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I hope everyone gets to see it. And I just think this is a beautiful, this is